Thank you so much, Brother DeBelfe. Genesis chapter 22 in your Bibles there. This week, as I was praying, I thought God was going to give me a message out of the story of Joseph. I had already made it past here and didn't feel as though we were going to look at this famous story, and wasn't quite sure why, but God wouldn't give me peace to go any certain direction. And yesterday morning, I got up and I started reading. I went back to chapter 18 of Genesis where we were last week and started going through 20 where we preached out of, and got to 22 again and went over it and just wasn't quite sure. And then I had a couple appointments, and after those appointments went back and started reading it again. I knew something was there, but I was just missing it. And then as I got to chapter 22 again, it started to fall into place. And I want to preach to you a message entitled this: He saw the place afar off. He saw the place afar off. The Lord here has asked Abraham to do a very, very difficult thing. One that I am sad to say, but pretty certain to say, most of us, if not all of us, would have told God no. God looks at Abraham and says, I want you to take your son, but not just your son, but your only son. And I want you to take him to the land of Moriah, and up on a mountain I want you to sacrifice him to me. And you think, what a harsh God. What a harsh God. Why would God ask that of him? And those are the questions that we all have when it comes to this story, but some of you are asking that question to God right now because of what you're going through. And today, some of you can't see the distant mountain afar off because maybe you're deep in the valley. Maybe you can't see it because the fog of the trial and the fog of the storm is it's clouding your judgment. But I want to tell you that the mountain is afar off this morning. It's out there. We just got to keep on going. I want to talk to you about 3 points that God just laid on my heart. In verse number 1 and 2, it says, and it came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham, and said unto him, Abraham, and he said, behold, here I am. And he said, take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains, which I will tell thee of. We find, number one this morning, God's test was for Abraham's benefit. God's test was for Abraham's benefit. We all go through hard times. There's not one person here that can say you've never been through a difficult time, but there are those that sit here today that say, well, I'm going through this and nobody understands what I'm going through, and that's your pride talking. There's always somebody else, for there's nothing new under the sun. There's always somebody else who understands what you've gone through or what you are going through. This test that God was taking Abraham through was for Abraham's benefit. Every once in a while, we have to just trust the Lord without speaking our foolish thoughts about how life is not fair. Too many folks want to just say, well, life's just not fair. You're exactly right, and God never promised or said that it would be. If you're going through life saying, well, God said it'd be better than this, and I would like to ask you to show me chapter and verse where God said life would be more fair than what it is. He never said that. All God ever asked us to do was to trust in Him. He thrives on the impossible. So don't be shocked when we or you find yourself in an impossible situation. That's when God shines. That's when God's best is seen. We look here and we find that this test was for Abraham's benefit. You see, in His omniscience, God already knew what Abraham would do. But Abraham did not know what Abraham would do. God already knew in asking Abraham, Abraham, I'm going to ask you to do something. God knew what Abraham would do. But Abraham didn't know what Abraham would do. God already knows what you're going to do. The test is for our benefit. Why? It's just so that we can see that depending on the Lord is worth it. Depending on the Lord is worth it. Through the most difficult trial that you find yourself in, let me tell you, trusting on God is worth it. Many of us have counseled Folks, and one of the hardest things to counsel is when you're sitting across from somebody with the tears flowing down their cheeks and the regret pouring out of their mouth from the emotions that have built up when they failed to trust God. And now they don't even know if God would ever take them back. And that's the devil lying, because God will always take us back. But it's far better if we just trust Him way back over here. And we never leave His side, because He promised He'd never leave or forsake us. God's test was for Abraham's benefit. So Abraham had already learned that trusting the Lord was best. So he stayed within the safety of God by trusting God through this difficult time. Abraham had already seen God do some incredible things. Abraham had watched as God had come down and He had destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham then watched as he went in to Abimelech, as we saw last week, and he lied and said, "This is my sister." And he watched as God came in and judged the house of Abimelech. Abraham knew that God had power. So when God asked this difficult thing of him, Abraham just had already made up his mind. I'm going to stay within the boundaries of the safety of God. I'm just going to keep on trusting. I fear that if this were asked of us, we would immediately say no. And the sad fact is, I believe God knows that too, which is why our world is in the condition that it is in today. Because God can't trust us like He could trust Abraham. We think the hard thing is when we lose power during a storm. We think the hard thing is when we're diagnosed with a severe illness. We think the hard thing is when our car won't start. We think the hard thing is when we lose a job. And can I say, in comparison to the stories we find in God's Word, those are easy things. But they sure are hard for us. And I think that just shows how far we've drifted from trusting the Lord with all our heart. We try to lean on our own understanding. And in some of our ways we acknowledge Him and we hope He'll direct our path. But that verse was written with far more surety than that. He said, "Trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not to thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge Him, and He shall direct thy path." There's safety within the boundaries of trusting God. And yet this test here wasn't a test for God. It was a test for Abraham's benefit. And the test that you find yourself in today, may I say, stay close and faithful to the Lord. Everything He does is for our good. If we will just accept that and trust Him, the victory will be sweet. The victory's so much sweeter if we just keep trusting the Lord. I used the phrase that John R. Rice said years and years ago when somebody approached him and said, "I just feel like I'm at the end of my rope." And John R. Rice said, without any hesitancy, he said, "Then grab onto God's, because His is a whole lot longer." And I can't tell you how many times talking with people just quickly, they'll say, "Pastor, I'm just at the end of my rope." And I'll say, "Hold on to God's, because His is a whole lot longer." You say, "Pastor, I just don't know how to make it." Just keep putting one foot in front of the other. You'll make it. Keep your eyes fixed on Christ. I was talking with a dear lady this morning. I think she's in here somewhere, right over here. And she was asking me about the end times a little bit and about the mark of the beast. I was glad to hear it, because these are great times that we live in. But may I remind you that these are not the times that are supposed to strike fear into our heart. For God hath not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. We ought not be afraid because they're putting chips in our animals' necks and they're giving you a debit card and you can go online and type in and buy all your Christmas gifts online. You say, "Oh, it's just another way for them to track me." Let me tell you something. If they want to find you, they're going to find you. But there's going to come a day when they go looking for you and they won't find you. They'll be baffled when millions across the world are gone, when graves are open and they don't have any explanation. Those are exciting things. So I use my debit card with glee. Not my credit card, my debit card. You see, the tests that we go through, they're for our benefit. They're to make us better. Number 2, we look at verses 3 through 11. And Abraham rose up in the morning and saddled his ass and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son, and clave the wood for the burnt offering, and rose up and went unto the place of which God had told him. Then on the 3rd day Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place afar off. And Abraham said unto his young men, Abide ye here with the ass, and I and the lad will go yonder and worship and come again to you. You know what I see in that verse? I see faith. Because he says in the verse, he said, and Abraham said unto, Abide here, and I and the lad will go yonder and worship and come again to you. He didn't say, and I'll come again. He said, references, we're going to come again. There's faith there. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it upon Isaac his son, and he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and they went both of them together. Can I say in verse number 6, these are just rabbit trails for you, but in verse number 6, he didn't change the way he would normally do things. You know, sometimes as I was reading yesterday, sometimes we're not careful. When we're going through difficult times, we change everything up. And God says, no, just stay faithful. Just keep doing it. So what do you mean, Pastor? Here in verse 6, Abraham didn't say, Isaac, let me carry it all. Let me carry it. Why? Because Abraham knew that he was about to sacrifice his son. And so, well, I'm going to make it easier on Isaac. No, he just kind of lived that day as though everything was going to be okay. And he still put the wood on Isaac. And he caused Isaac to carry, he asked Isaac to carry all of this stuff, and he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and they went both of them together. And Isaac spake unto Abraham his father and said, My father. And he said, Here am I, my son. And he said, Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, My son, well, here's faith again. God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. So they went both of them together. And they came to the place which God had told him of, and Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched forth his hand and took the knife to slay his son, and the angel of the Lord called unto him out of heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham! And he said, Here am I. We find not only God's test was for Abraham's benefit, but secondly, we find the torment in Abraham's heart. Could you imagine packing everything up and walking for three days, talking with your son along the way, and all the time knowing that God has asked you to sacrifice your boy? Oh, the agony in his heart. The anguish that Abraham must have felt as they traveled. Are you tormented this morning because God has led you down a path that is far more difficult to travel than you ever thought possible? Notice Abraham didn't try to have a better idea how to fix it. He just did as the Lord commanded. He didn't, when they got there, he didn't say, Isaac, let me, that would have made it odd for Isaac. Dad, you always have me care. What's different today? No, he said, we're just going to live our life the same. Why? There was that measure of faith deep down inside Abraham, because Abraham had seen God do some incredible things in his life. And I believe that Abraham was resting in that promise that God had given to him when he said, I'm going to make you the father of many nations. And Abraham knew it had to start with Isaac. This is my first boy. God, this is the promised son. You said that we would have this boy, and you did. You gave him to us in our old age. May I say, the torment that you have while you are trusting in the Lord is far better than the torment you will have if you abandon the Lord. The torment that you have right now while you are trusting the Lord is far better than the torment you will have if you abandon the Lord. So don't abandon him. Too many of us quit when the times get too hard for us. However, the Lord has to make it too hard for me so that I will let him take care of me. The Lord has to put us through some times and give us some tests that we can't handle. Because he knows us and we try to solve everything. So many times we miss that next step in faith because we just come up with some weird, strange humanistic type way that we can solve this problem. And God says, here's a problem you can't solve. Here's one that you cannot mediate. Here's something you can't talk your way out of. Here's some hole you can't dig your way out of. There is no other way except for you to look up to me and trust me. So go ahead and make it through the tough time. This test was for Abraham's benefit, and we find the torment that must have been in Abraham's heart. And then lastly this morning, we find in verses 12 through 14, and he said, this is the angel, lay not thine hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him. For now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering in the stead of his son. And Abraham called the name of the place Jehovah-Jireh, as it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord it shall be seen. Not only God's test was for Abraham's benefit, the torment that must have been in Abraham's heart, but lastly, the timing of God is always perfect. His timing is always perfect. It's perfect. You say, well, I need him to answer it now. No, his timing's always perfect. Now, we can mess up his timing if we stop trusting him, if we stop following him, we choose to do our own thing, then we mess up the timing. Why? Because we got in the way. But if I'll just step out of the way and take myself out of the equation in areas that God doesn't want me, and if I'll just keep taking every step that God orders my feet to take, all of a sudden I will begin to see that God's timing is always perfect. And whatever I found myself in, I begin to realize that it was for my benefit. And therefore, I'm ready to embrace the next test that may come. Have you ever been through a test and passed it? A test that God has taken you through? Or have you quit everyone? The timing of God is always perfect. Know this, God is always right on time to those who travel the path he has chosen for us. Many today will miss the blessing because you said no to the test all the way back in verse number 2. In verse number 2, if you'll look there, and he said, take now thy son, thine only son Isaac. We would have said, no, not happening. Choose somebody else. Why didn't you choose their son? Why does it always have to be me? We would have messed it up all the way back in verse number 2, and we would have never seen the ram caught in the thicket in verse number 13. We mess God's plans up. God doesn't mess up, we mess up. You're going through a problem today and you wonder why your life is just in a tailspin. It seems like everything's a mess. Well, it may be a test that's for your benefit, or you may have messed it up. So I'd ask you to go back to verse number 2 in your life, where God asks the hard thing of you, and say, all right, Lord, here I am, I'm back here. It may be 5 years, 10 years, 20 years later, but Lord, I'm back here and I'm ready to say yes. I'll give you my only boy if that's what you want. Can I say to you today, God is asking for some of our children, but because we've got them in all these other programs and we're taking them out of church and we're trying to throw our own dreams and desires in front of them and kind of dangle that carrot of what we think they ought to do in front of them. We have taken them off God's course, and they're trusting in money. They're trusting in fame. They're trusting in family. They're trusting in all of these different things, and God's not even anywhere in their thinking process. If you're not careful, parents, you're going to take your kids away from what God has for them. And that is the most dangerous place your kids can be. The safest place for your children is not living next door to you. The safest place for your children is in the center of God's will. We find that the timing of God is always perfect. Let's stop trying to understand God and try harder to follow God. God may not be working on your timetable, but if you will work on His, you will find the joy that you seek. Notice that each time the Lord called Abraham's name, Abraham was close enough to hear the Lord and answered Him on the first call. In verse number 1, look there with me. In verse number 1, and it came to pass that God did tempt Abraham and said unto him, Abraham, and he said, Behold, here I am. At verse number 11, and the angel of the Lord called unto him out of heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham, and he said, Here am I. It's a pretty good thing that God and Abraham were on speaking terms. Because could you imagine what would have happened if he had that knife raised in the air and he and God weren't on speaking terms? He would have lost a boy that day, and it wouldn't have been God's will. We better be careful what we blame God for and just stay so close to Him that we can hear His voice. Hear it. My son talks in his sleep a little bit, and the other night, my wife, he was doing it probably around 11:15, I guess. And my wife said, that's Mark talking in his sleep. And I haven't been able to fall asleep before about 1:30, 2 o'clock in the morning. And so every night I hear him. Normally he starts talking about 1 o'clock. And it's a cute thing, but it's just, you always just wonder, what's he going to say? And so when he starts yelling at his sisters that, you got a problem. And so she says to me, she said, he's talking in his sleep. I said, yeah, every night. She said, really? And I said, yeah. You know why? Because he's in my house. He's close enough for me to hear. My son and I have a close relationship. The other morning, she was a little too close, but the other morning I'm sleeping, and I had my head facing out, not in toward the center of the bed, but toward the outside. And I'm laying there, and I just feel like somebody's looking at me. And so I slowly open my eyes, and I look, and there's Madeline on her, she's just on her knees like this, just staring at me. I mean, she's eye level. That's a little too close. And I said, what are you doing? She said, I just wanted to say good morning. I said, that's a little freaky. Go back to bed. And she got up and went back. I hope she was awake. Every once in a while, Meredith got sick last night. And Meredith's our little drama queen. And after she got sick, she wanted everybody to know she had got sick, if you know what I mean. And so she comes walking in, I got sick. We're like, yeah, we heard you. And she comes all the way around the couches to stand right in front of me to say, I got sick. And I said, you need a hug? Yes, sir. And so she came in, and I gave her a hug, and then before bed I carried her up the stairs, and she just thought that was the greatest thing. I like when my kids are close to me. I like when they're close to me. It makes me feel like they love me. It's not just a card that they say they love me. It's actually them showing me that they love me. I'll get that in a few minutes. If you tell them, I'll get back to it. I think the Lord likes when we're so close that we're showing Him that we love Him. It's not loving Him by convenience. Just showing up whenever we need something. But ready for whenever He calls my name. Here am I, Lord. Here I am. Matter of fact, when Isaac and he are going up the mountain, Isaac says, Father, and he says, here I am, son. They were close enough to have a good relationship. I don't know what test everybody's going through, but I know some of you are going through some pretty big tests. Can I say the test is for our benefit? God already knows the outcome is going to be according to his perfect will. He just wants to show me that it's according to his perfect will. The timing of God is always perfect. Boy, sometimes we wish God would just solve it the moment we find out about it, but every once in a while it takes a lot of time. Maybe you've been waiting years. Just stay faithful. His timing's always perfect. And you ought to go to God and say, God, what are you trying to teach me in this? I want my children to know that their mom and dad knew what it was to make it through some difficult times. Not to talk bad about the Lord, not to talk bad about this person or that person or the situation, but to find joy and glory in the infirmity. To rejoice in the struggle. We all have them. Teenagers today, some of you have burdens that nobody would understand. But God understands it. And if you'll just keep trusting him. You say, Pastor, how do I do it? Number one, you've got to be saved. If you want the benefit of the Heavenly Father, you've got to be saved. Number two, if you are saved, you're going to have to stay surrendered. You're going to have to give up your will and just surrender to his. Our heads are bowed, our eyes are closed, with nobody looking around.